Շնորհակալություն Չերպոլովին, Ասերավերին, Դիգին Սալպիղազարյանին եւ Հավավային California համալսարանին. I will speak in English, but I wanted to thank the organizers in Armenian as well. I'm going to start with a bit of a biographical note, very briefly. I'm not that important to go on and on about my accomplishments. But there was a time that I used to teach post-Soviet politics at the LSE. I did my PhD there, and I stayed to teach for a couple of years. Then I did this thing that's called transition and democratic development for about 10 years. So basically this presentation is coming from that perspective of having taught this subject and studied it and having done it. I did it for about 10 years for a Canadian quasi-governmental organization. I'm guilty of all the things that Rob English mentioned in terms of democratic development and human rights promotion, but it was a Canadian organization, so things couldn't be so bad, I suppose. This is based on the perspective of a lapsed academician's view and a practitioner's perspective. And I should also mention that now I'm at the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation, but this presentation does not represent, I'm not here in my official capacity to represent the foundation. So and I did prepare a bit of a PowerPoint presentation to entertain you, I suppose, a little bit as well. So next slide. This was considered the Bible when I was teaching transitology, as it is now called. It used to be called Sovietology, then it transitioned into transitology. And it's a book by Linz and Stepan about the consolidation of democratic development or transition, comparing Eastern Europe, post-Soviet countries with Latin American dictatorships and Southern Europe. Talks about waves of democratization and whatnot. So it was an important book, and it still is an important book if you want to understand this period. And also, you know, this is when we were talking about shock therapy versus gradual reform, etc., etc. The last lecture I gave at the LSE, I really confused my students by showing them the book that I was reading when I was a master's student 10 years earlier. The next slide. If you can go to the next slide. I was reading 10 years earlier in '86 a book that was about transition to socialism. I was studying Latin American politics, and the debate was about transition to socialism. And this book has chapters such as external finance and the transition to socialism, economic and politics in the transition to socialism, reflections on the Nicaraguan experience, the role of ideology in the transition to socialism. So in 10 years, there was a complete shift in global discourse from transition to socialism to transition from socialism to capitalism and democratization. So, as I said, next, please. So, as I said, I was privileged to this for about a decade, democratic development and human rights promotion. And it was in the role of a funder of various projects. I worked in all sorts of countries except in the former Soviet countries, so my academic expertise was not used in the content, but of course the process was important. And so after doing it for a few years, I wrote a little very short piece regarding the lessons learned from the field. Now remember, this was a time of possibilities, a time of hope that things were happening. China was opening up. We thought that we could have an impact on Afghanistan. Turkey was opening up. So they were not, you know, China by no means was a democracy, but it was, you know, moving towards some sort of an open system, etc., etc. We always linked democratic development and human rights. We did not see that as separate processes. And as I said, I was privileged to go to places like Afghanistan, Haiti, Democratic Republic of Congo, China, Morocco to do this kind of work. And the photo itself is something I took from a car in Kabul. In every case, I noticed that there was a dynamic at play that made this possible, and that was a certain opening from the top. In the case of Afghanistan, of course, it was forced opening, but there was a certain opening from the top and a pressure from below. So the political will of the elites mattered, And the push from below, the civil society work mattered to actually open or widen the crack further. And you had to work at both ends of the spectrum with the political elite, the ministers, and etc., and also the civil society organizations that were working on women's rights and whatnot. Now, reflecting back to this, because I haven't done this work for a while now, track record, mostly failure. I mean, how many positive examples of countries can we say that we had a very good positive impact? Perhaps Colombia to some degree, because we did some work in Colombia, but South Sudan, China is going back, in Afghanistan, I don't think we can say that the transition is leading to anything that resembles a democratic country at this point. So the next slide. So based on this, I jotted down some 9 points regarding transition and democratization. Again, I'm putting the emphasis not on the economic aspect of transition, but the political, democratization aspect of the transition. So I will, I think I have about 6 minutes, so I will spend maybe about 4 of them on this slide, because I think it's important to go to each one of these points. The first thing is that democracy is not a stage. It is a process, it's a dynamic process, and it can be reversed and it can be weakened. So there is no final phase of it. The trick is its institutionalization and its routinization. So if it's not linear, if it could be circular, one has to talk about detransition, I suppose, or anti-transition, and the terminology will come back to in a minute. The second point is that in addition to institutions, the soft side of it, the culture of democracy, inculcating the culture of democracy is crucially important as well. I don't buy for 1 minute the culture versus institutions debate. You need both. You need both the culture and the institutions, and they reinforce each other. A vibrant civil society and strong state institutions. A brief note on NGOs that we had to work quite a bit with. NGOs is not necessarily civil society. Donors always, not always, often, excuse me. Donors often create NGOs which are closer to them than to their own societies. And that's a recipe for failure. So one has to work with civil society that is much more organic. The third point is that outside aid is important, but there is no cookie cutter approach. There is no a model that you can impose from country to country. Democracy cannot be exported, but it could be encouraged. And of course, the other side of the coin is that those who are against the transition process could use the local culture as excuses why democracy cannot take root in their society. And I won't go there because of the lack of time. And conditionality, therefore, becomes important. The fourth is elections, that elections are important, but they're not the most important thing. What happens in between elections is just as important. So election monitoring is important, but also monitoring what goes on in between them. The fifth point is something more specific to the Middle Eastern context, that often democratization theory said that secularization has to take place before democratization, and I think that's been proven to be wrong. As long as extremism is not at play and everyone respects the rules of the game. The sixth point is that democracy as an idea does face competition globally. It does face a backlash, often using its own language of human rights and elections, but it does face a backlash, and there are alternative models out there. The international component, the seventh point, not so much about geopolitics, but also in terms of the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times, or contagion, which sounds like a disease, but the fact that one country or one region democratizes has an impact because the mood of the times changes, and this is important. The tone that Trump and Erdogan set in terms of the mood matters. The eighth point is the link between democracy and economic development. A huge point my argument is that it's not linear. There is no threshold that you have to reach economically to become a democratic society. So poor countries can be democratic. And the final point is the informal exercise of power, i.e. institutions matter, they're important, but let's also be a bit of anthropologists and understand how informal power is exercised sometimes to subvert those institutions. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll quickly go over some points regarding Armenia. So globally, where are we at now? We're talking about the consolidation of electoral illiberalism most of the time, consolidation of elites with limited commitment to democracy. We're also talking about an ineffective and tired civil society in many of these countries, in post-Soviet countries as well, and the further sidelining of human rights, which is central to democratic development. The next slide. So 4 set of factors to look at the case of Armenia, actually 5, I added something a bit later. It's the willingness of the elites to walk down the path of democratic development, and as a person who actually did this kind of work, I would say, how can this be encouraged? We should also ask that question. The capacity of civil society to influence policy and the elites, and how can this be augmented? The neighborhood, the big 3, Russia, Iran, and Turkey, their domestic politics matter here in terms of the example, the spirit of the times that I mentioned earlier. And we should keep in mind that we're talking about this in the context of war with Azerbaijan. The 5th point that I added emerges out of something I just read a couple of days ago regarding the graduating class from schools here in Armenia. Of 10,000 or so applicants to universities, which was 1,500 less than last year, 5,200 wanted to study Armenian language and literature. That's the most. So half wanted to study Armenian language and literature. The least, in terms of topic, wanted to study international history, 88. This got me thinking the importance of opening up to the world and studying the world and understanding the world and seeing yourself in comparison to the world. And I think that's an important 5th point I would add if I give this presentation again. Next slide. I'm not going to go on and on about this work. This just came out 2 weeks ago. It's a very, very interesting, fascinating study, religious belief and national belonging in Central and Eastern Europe. A couple of statistics that really blew my mind, I suppose. The first one, Armenia is not so bad. The percent who say that democracy is preferable to any other kind of government, 53% in Armenia. In some circumstances, non-democratic government can be preferable, 13%, and 32%, interestingly, it doesn't matter. But it gets really, in some ways, worrisome on the next slide, that if you ask the question, percentage who say that the breakup of the Soviet Union was a bad thing for their country, 74% of people who had no experience with the Soviet Union as adults, 18 to 34 age group, 74% say that it was a bad thing, the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is in Armenia, and the average being 79. And the next slide, when asked which former Soviet who say that it is more important for their country to have strong ties with Russia, Armenia is the highest. 71% say Armenia and 8% the European Union. So, in conclusion, I'm a couple of minutes over time, I think. In conclusion, should we still use the paradigm of transition or shift to a different paradigm? Next slide, the concluding slide. This is very easily accessible. You just Google the title and you'll get it. Are we talking about consolidated illiberalism, electoral authoritarianism, or if you want to be optimistic that the transition is going to come back and we're going to continue? Another important question is that, is this the end of idealism, the grand projects of change, or as some people have withdrawn into smaller projects, small initiatives focusing on their own community, saying that we don't care about the big picture, we just want to improve our own community? Could there be accumulative changes that will lead to systemic change eventually? And finally, a word about, to us Armenians in diaspora, the choices that we as diasporan Armenians have vis-à-vis Armenia itself, given this rather bleak picture. Do we accept it as it is with the occasional visits? Do we engage with Armenia for change, or do we just turn back and move on? And I think at this point the diaspora is starting to actually ask these questions and think about them. Thank you very much.